So the video is going to focus on a critique of agriculture or industrial agriculture. And I'm also going to provide some solutions as to how we could mediate these major issues caused by the industrial agriculture system that we've put together. So one of the primary concerns is that the industrial agriculture is not sustainable, okay? And we can focus on many different ways that it's not sustainable. A lot of people tend to focus on the environmental impact. We're losing arable soil, we're losing, viable water, and we're losing, we're putting a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. These are very identifiable and actually, measurable ways that industrial agriculture is ruining the world presently. We're seeing climate change happening on a larger context than what was predicted by a lot of the scientists. For example, we're noticing, fires in Siberia, which is supposed to be a cold climate. We're also noticing, like in Australia, in the west coast right now of North America, and even in the rainforest in Brazil, there's been massive fires over the last year, to the extent that they're growing a lot more pervasive, and actually the fires are getting a lot worse than they have. And one of the major culprits is agriculture. Okay, so we could look at the impact on the environment that industrial agriculture has. But there's other ways to understand why this is not sustainable, and ways that we could critique the system itself, even coming from an economic basis. Because a lot of people will think that agriculture, industrial agriculture feeds people, and therefore there are other mitigating factors. We just need to make them better. And I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to show you that no, we've actually set up a system itself that's extremely problematic and needs to be changed. So the first thing I want to focus on here is it's not even economically viable as a system. So farms themselves, industrial agriculture farms are not profitable. And here I'm showing you on the aggregate. What industrial farms are doing is they're taking out massive debts to cover the cost of large equipment that they need to buy to keep up with the other farms, as well as to keep on purchasing GMO seeds and fertilizers. There's a lot of inputs that go into industrial agriculture, and it's actually making it so the industry itself is not profitable. So here's just a couple of graphs. This is Darren Quailman wrote a whole chapter looking and deconstructing the economics of industrial agriculture, and then actually even followed up. So I provided a link here, and actually has a website that follows up from the chapter that was published. So if we look at agricultural exports, well, what we're noticing is in Canada, the agricultural exports are increasing from year to year, to the extent that Canada is one of the largest agricultural exporters of the world. Now, the strange thing is even though we're producing more and exporting more, well, we're not obtaining the same amounts in profits when it comes to farmers. So actually, to the extent is the profit margins, the farmers are losing more money than they're gaining on the aggregate presently in Canada, okay? Now, why is that? Is because farmers are taking out more and more debt, okay? If you look at here, this is the debt for Canadian farms, and the debt is increasing quite drastically. And the reason is because these chemical and fertilizer companies and GMO seed companies make these farms sign multi-year agreements that they're going to use their specific seeds and fertilizers over a specific time. That's part of the agreement. And basically, the cost of the inputs are getting quite high for the farmers. Farmers can't keep up with the technologies and all of these things that are going into present-day industrial agriculture, okay? So who's making the money really is the seed and fertilizer companies, and the farmers are not making enough to even be viable and survive as a farm. So in Canada, we subsidize a lot of our farming. So farmers get subsidies and insurance and different things like that. And even with that, are having trouble surviving as an economic entity, okay? This is not to say that some farms don't do well. Yes, there are certain farms that do well. And actually, even in Quebec, there's examples of people that are actually operating outside of this industrial agriculture frame and doing more organic or other kind of agroeconomy or agroecology, and basically eliminating these fertilizers and seeds that are being purchased from these large companies. But look, on the aggregate, farming is not viable in Canada. So who is these seeds and agriculture companies, agrochemical companies that are actually taking all the money from our farmers? Well, these are the large ones here that are the seed companies. And what we're noticing is a lot of these companies have formed into larger multinational conglomerate companies. So Bayer now owns Monsanto. So these two companies have merged together, and Bayer now owns all of the holdings of Monsanto, except for the stuff that was sold off. Anyhow, so Bayer is the largest agriculture or agro seed company in the world, and actually are making a lot of money selling seeds to farmers. Other ones, Corteva, basically is Dow and DuPont that have formed into a conglomerate company. Also, Syngenta and Chinachem have done the same as well. So when I used to present this graph years ago, actually these companies were broken up. So Dow and DuPont were two separate companies. Bayer and Monsanto were two separate companies. Syngenta and Chinachem were two separate companies. And now what's happening is basically they're merging together and buying each other up to form these huge mega corporations that actually control a lot of the profits of our food and actually, dictate how seeds and all of these things basically are the ones creating GMOs and the chemicals. So if we look at the agrochemical companies, we see Bayer, Syngenta, Chinachem, BASF, Corteva, which is a mix of Dow and DuPont, amongst others. So these are the companies that are extracting the profits from our farmers, okay? Because they're charging a lot of money for these seeds and the agrochemicals. And because of that, our farms are not viable in Canada and other parts of the world. Now, these companies are terrible companies. And I don't want to say this in the way of like good and bad or whatever the case is, but if you actually look at the practices of these companies, they've done terrible things in the world, okay? So these companies used to be, or still are, war companies that actually make chemicals that are used in wars. So, here's a few examples. So Monsanto actually has been using chemicals like Agent Orange, or basically developed chemicals like Agent Orange, which has been used to kill people in wars. They actually have also kind of published this thing on their website, talking about how now they use the chemicals that were used in Agent Orange, and they divided it up, and now they're used in our food, and this is wonderful for us, which is a kind of a strange thing altogether. But these chemicals were actually used for war, and now have kind of got a secondary life to them and are being used in agriculture. Some kind of glaring examples, BASF and Bayer used to be part of a larger company called IG Farben, who used to manufacture Zyklon B for the gas chambers during the World Wars. So during, when Nazi Germany were actually using Zyklon B, it was being manufactured by BASF and Bayer as part of a larger group called IG Farben, okay? So if you want to, you can actually go here to the different links I provided, and it actually has more of kind of a larger story about this. And you can actually find out more if you'd like to. Dow Chemical invented Agent Orange and have sold it to different countries to be used in different wars across the world also. Monsanto has been caught ghostwriting academic papers, so they know that some of their products are harmful for us. For example, glyphosate has been identified by the World Health Organization as something that's cancer causing. And Monsanto has gone on the offensive to try to debunk this and basically say it's not, by ghostwriting papers, academic papers, and getting these lobbyists to go around saying it's safe. So if you want to see a funny video, click on this link here, and you have a Monsanto lobbyist basically claiming on air on a national French television newscast that it's safe to drink, and actually got challenged by the journalist basically saying if it's safe, then drink it. And the person kind of embarrasses themselves and walks off without drinking Roundup because it's definitely not safe to drink. So these companies have been involved in a whole bunch of disasters, as well as, have been, the manufacturers of very toxic chemicals that have been used in wars. So Dow Chemical owns now Union Carbide that was responsible for a large devastating explosion in Bhopal, India. We can actually find out about it here, but basically they're manufacturing chemicals that were used in agriculture. So these things are very, very dangerous chemicals. Actually, if you look at what's happened in Lebanon, you have chemicals that are actually used in agriculture that actually caused this massive explosion. These chemicals are very devastating, and actually by these companies that I showed you before were used in wars to kill people for death and destruction, and are now used in agriculture. So there are major other issues with food, and I could probably spend, the whole class not talking about urban agriculture, but actually talking about issues with our current industrial food system. So here are just some of them, okay? There's issues with food security. There's over 800 million people still starving in the world today. And actually, if we look at people that are food insecure, the number goes up to about 2 or just over 2 billion people. And the world has just over 7.5 billion people currently. So there's a large portion of the world, about, depending on how we're measuring food insecurity, there's up to 2 billion people, or even a little bit more than that are food insecure, but about 800 million people starving in the world today. So, the kind of impetus for this large agriculture system that we put together is that, well, we need industrial agriculture to feed the world. And this has been purported since the advent of the Green Revolution in about the 1960s. Certain people that are scientists and as well as agricultural companies have made the assertion that we need industrial agriculture, we need GMOs, we need technology to feed the world. Well, the problem is becoming more exacerbated than it has, and we're actually growing the numbers of people that are starving throughout the world. Now, this is not a problem of supply, because technically we could feed the world over about 1.5 times over with the current supply that's available. It's actually a problem of our political and economic system not able to provide people with basic survival needs. And basically, when we have a socially unjust system, it's very well reflected in our food system also. So, in order to have food justice, we need social justice, and these two things go hand in hand. So the problem is not just about producing food, it's actually about getting food to people when they don't have the means, the economic means to actually afford it, and actually about raising people's standards of living across the world. There's also issues with food sovereignty. So peasants and farmers are being affected by free trade agreements and food dumping, especially in places in the global south. Places like Mexico, where United States were dumping very cheap food commodities into Mexican markets because United States highly subsidized certain foods like corn and other things that were being produced in Mexico. And the farmers in Mexico couldn't keep up with these food prices because providing cheap food commodities that are being subsidized by governments really decimates the economy in certain areas. So food sovereignty has been a major issue for certain people, and especially food producers and peasants in places like the global south, but in places like Africa and all over the world, where governments like the United States and other European governments and even Canadian governments are subsidizing large portions of agriculture and dumping cheap food commodities into places in the world. It sounds great to have cheap food, but when the farmers can't compete in those areas with cheaper prices, then they no longer become viable, and then certain areas become dependent on these cheap food prices continuously, and they're not always available. So that's an issue. There's issues with herbicides. So there's basically GMOs that are designed that are called Roundup Ready and sold by Monsanto or Bayer. That basically you could spray Roundup on the plants, and since they're Roundup Ready, they're not affected by the glyphosates and actually are tolerant towards them, but the other herbs are not. So basically weeds in the garden will be affected by that, but not necessarily affect the main plant. But what we're realizing is actually the weeds are adapting, and they're now adapting to glyphosates and other herbicides, and are actually becoming super weeds. As well as, glyphosates are being shown as cancer causing. So we don't really want to have these sprayed all over our plants. So these are major issues. We have issues with privatization. So as you've read in some of the chapters, is that there's big land buy-ups in certain areas, especially where we have arable land, like in certain places in Africa, there's still cheap arable land available that are being bought up by large companies. But at the same time, we're privatizing all aspects of food. So we're privatizing genetics. We're restricting access for people that have their own farms that sometimes are cross-contaminated by genetically modified seeds that are patented. And you've read about certain examples, if you read the chapters that I assigned to you, and certain farmers got sued by Monsanto because of cross-contamination of their crops. So it's an issue to have everything privatized, because it means that we're restricting access to seeds, to land, and to other things. There's an issue with cost on farmers. So like I showed you in the previous slides, farms are no longer becoming viable, especially if people are keeping up with seeds, chemicals, fertilizers, and putting a lot of inputs into their garden. It becomes extremely expensive and no longer a viable business. We're reducing biodiversity. So there's so many different plant species available, but the ones that we're prioritizing are the ones that actually provide good food to markets. So things that'll actually keep a longer shelf life, and basically reducing the biodiversity of the plants that are being provided in supermarkets, because there are certain plants that are better for markets, although they're not better necessarily for growing conditions and other things. So in reducing biodiversity, we're actually limiting the amount of plants that are available and actually reducing different species that require certain plants as well. It's actually extremely problematic to reduce biodiversity. We actually want to be doing the exact opposite. So issues with unwanted genetic spreading into non-GMO farms. This has happened in places like in Mexico, where there's certain breeding that's been done on corn for thousands of years, and all of a sudden Monsanto seed comes, cross-contaminates. Now we've ruined our seeds. And then other issues, like I was describing, of people that have got sued by Monsanto or other farms because of cross-contamination of their seeds. So unwanted genetic spreading is an issue. Loss with indigenous farming methods. And on top of that, this is on stolen land in Canada and other places in the world. So colonization, we've displaced indigenous populations and then imposed, colonial farming methods that were not necessarily part of indigenous farming practices. And then we're telling indigenous populations how to go about doing agricultural methods that are not even part of the conditions of the land before Europeans came and colonized. And we're actually losing a lot of the knowledge of actually how to work with the land in harmony, with nature itself and with people that are residing upon the land. So these are major issues. We're losing a lot of the indigenous farming understandings and, going towards this kind of one approach of just having industrial agriculture. We're losing soil arability. It seems weird for a lot of people because you go outside and you probably see earth or soil, but arable soil, things that actually contain microorganisms and nutrients and actually are not, being washed into the water and actually, have good structures of roots and other things that we need in the soil, we're losing this because we're tilling lands and in large industrial agriculture, farms. And from that, basically just kind of putting chemical fertilizers and not building the soil properly. So basically what they call dead soil. The soil doesn't have nutrients and it doesn't have microorganisms that are needed to grow plants. And instead, basically, we replace this with chemicals and then do this over and over. And basically, we're killing more and more of our soil. We're killing our pollinators. So bees are also susceptible to the poisons that we're spraying on our plants. So things that kill other unwanted pests also kill pollinators. And this is a problem. We need pollinators in order to get our food produced. We're creating dead zones in water. So basically we have large pools in the ocean, as well as, even in the Great Lakes, if you're looking at Canada, that are called dead zones. So there are zones where you have high concentrations of nitrogen and it kills all of the life forms that are in these dead zones. So, we can't use this for our own kind of pleasure about swimming or other things, but also it becomes highly toxic to other organisms that are using the water, for their own habitat. There's issues with corporate concentration of agribusiness. So as we're noticing, or as you saw from the last slide, these companies are merging into large, major companies and actually dictating a lot of what happens in agriculture because they're able to, provide all of the necessities for farmers and lead farmers into these large contracts that they need to keep buying seeds and fertilizers from. So, we're having a very large corporate concentration of food, and this goes into other respects also that I'm going to describe throughout the course. Issues with health. So our food is now containing, highly toxic chemicals that are being sprayed on the plants, like glyphosates or other poisons that are pesticides. The foundation of our system is actually based on structural racism, colonialism, and patriarchy. So what do I mean by that? Actually, if you look at especially slaves that were brought over from Africa during the colonization period, a lot of these people were put to work on plantations and farms and actually were made to produce food for people that were working for capitalists. And the practice still operates till today. So, some of you may say, well, slavery doesn't exist how it did in the past. Well, look at our farming practices, especially in Canada. During COVID, there was a huge debate about how do we bring in migrant laborers to work on farms. And actually, if you look at the amount of migrant laborers coming to work on Canadian farms, it's quite astronomical. Canada imports laborers for the summer to work on our farms, and then basically, these people leave Canada after the summer. The pandemic at this point has exposed a lot of the structural racism, because there's a discussion about how to bring in people from other countries when there's a pandemic. How do we isolate people and not? The other thing is there's been major outbreaks on some of these farms because these people were not given adequate conditions for social distancing, and to some extent were actually isolated, told that they couldn't leave their environment because they've been exposed to COVID and couldn't even go get proper food for themselves. If we look at colonialism, when Europeans came to North America, they usurped land from the First Nations communities, from indigenous populations, and basically imposed property laws and other things that were not part of the societies before, and basically dictated to indigenous populations about how to lead their lives according to European understandings, and basically how to have an agricultural system based on that also. We look at patriarchy. There's a very unequal dispersion of labor in agriculture. Women are actually the largest producers of food in the world, and that's not necessarily recognized, as well as a lot of the household daily chores are taken up by women still even in industrialized societies. So there's a huge disproportion of equality when it comes to who's actually producing food and getting recognized for this. Rising costs of seeds and chemicals, so they're becoming more and more expensive, making farms less viable economically. Research funding is being directed at GMOs instead of traditional breeding methods. So when people talk about science, they're referring to a specific version of science. And science doesn't mean that we need more technology, or we need to implement more GMOs or other things like that. We could actually understand science by looking at traditional methods of growing, about breeding techniques, about soil revitalization, and other things also. But when we direct research funding towards a very specific view of science, well, that's what we get then, okay? So we need to actually expand ourselves outside of this purview of GMOs and just trying to industrialize as much of our agriculture system as possible. We need to take steps back from that, and we need to be doing the opposite and invest our scientific research into understand how to go back to the old methods of farming that actually didn't wreak havoc on the world and on social systems. Another one here is that there's pest resistance to Bt crops and glyphosates. We've devised these crops that contain a microorganism called Bacillus thuringiensis, which people actually use on their crops. It's a spore that actually kills certain insects, and it's actually natural. But what we've done is we've gone to genetically modify the spore and put it into certain plants, like cotton. And what we're realizing is actually the pests are becoming resistant to this because they're finding ways to adapt to their environment and actually, be resistant to these crops now. And they're being, weeds are being resistant to glyphosates. Now look, I'm just opening up a small version of a critique here. There's so much to be said, even over and above what I'm mentioning right here. But I'm going to stop the critique here and go into ways of actually understanding this critique and providing better ways to produce food. Before so, though, there's two quotes that are very interesting that I wanted you to think about. And this is from Eric Holt-Gimenez, which is a book that's been referred to a couple times in the readings that I've assigned to you. I would highly recommend you read this book at some point if you're interested in this topic. So this is called The Foodie's Guide to Capitalism, Understanding the Political Economy of What We Eat. This is actually quite a wonderful book, and he elaborates more on some of the stuff that I've described already in my lecture. But one of the quotes that I've taken from this is Eric Holt-Gimenez says, calls to fix a broken food system assume that the capitalist food system used to work well. This assumption ignores the food system's long racialized history of mistreatment of people of color. The food system is unjust and unsustainable, but it's not broken. It functions precisely as the capitalist food system has always worked, concentrating power into the hands of the privileged minority and passing off social environmental externalities disproportionately to racially stigmatized groups. Basically, what he's saying here is that the system's not broken and needs to be fixed. It's actually rotten from the core. It's actually been devised to do exactly what it's doing now, to provide profits to these large agrochemical companies that are actually profiting very largely off of a very broken system. You know, our farmers are struggling, but Bayer and Monsanto and all of the companies that I was mentioning before are actually doing very well profit-wise, okay? At the same time, they're destroying our natural habitat and making the conditions very difficult for people to function within it. So these things need to change, but it's not that we need to fix a broken system. We actually need to replace the whole system itself. And you know, going to the second quote here, they're talking about how to produce these kind of systems. It's kind of like we're caught into a very weird transition where, you know, to address capitalism and the issues with it, we need to transform our food system. But in order to transform our food system, we need to actually transform the political and economic systems also. So, you know, we're kind of caught trying to chase our tail sometimes. So how we produce and consume determines how society is organized. But how we organize socially and politically also determine how we produce and consume. The implications of this are profound. Our food system are vessels of unmatched social and economic power that pivot sites for economic transformation. So, you know, in that, we need to kind of change the capitalist system and the political and economic system to produce better food. But at the same time, food is front and center of this transformation. So look, I don't want to kind of get caught in the circular argument here. I'm going to provide you some viable alternatives and some ways to fix this. So the first thing I recommend is to reconnect with our food, okay? Grow your own food, transform your own food, you know, compost your own food, build your own soil, look at water saving, try to do as much of this as you can, okay? Especially with economic conditions that may arise because of COVID. You know, we're noticing a lot of unemployment that has arisen recently, and I don't know how long this is going to last. But if we go into a full major recession, you're going to want to connect with your own food, okay? Because it's going to be very difficult to buy food if you don't have the means to do so. So, you know, I highly encourage you to do so either at your own house or to get involved in projects in the community that produces your own food. You know, try to make your own things, like make breads or make other things, transform foods, grow foods, do as much as you can, but reconnect with food. Prioritize our biosphere and social system over markets. And we hear time and time again how we need to protect the economy and save the economy. Well, we're talking about a very specific version of an economy. And actually, we've come in today's society to actually equate economy to market. But there's way beyond that. Economy has actually stemmed from the management of a household. Economia was actually meant for managing our own household, which then was an extension about managing communities, and then became about managing society. Now, actually, we equate it with markets, and that's about all. And we need to think past them. We need to also participate in progressive and radical food movements. Okay, and what do I mean by that? I'm going to get into a little bit more detail in this lecture. But, you know, in a nutshell, is that we need to not just try to fix what's broken with the system, but we need to revamp the system itself, and we need to actually provide different conditions for different food relations to exist. So it means that we're not just providing band-aid solutions, like, you know, it's really great that food banks exist, but they're not going to transform the food system entirely. You know, it's good to give provisions to people when they need them, but what we need to do is actually we need to transform the systems themselves and not just redistribute from the wealthy, you know, to give people food when necessary. We need to transform the systems. And I highly encourage you all to get involved with urban agriculture and or collective gardening initiatives, because as you know, what you probably have realized is a lot of people live in urban settings. So the majority of the world live in urban settings. A lot of them live in coastal environments. But, you know, we have very high densely populated areas of people that we can actually feed in these urban environments also. So I'm not saying do away with rural agriculture. Yes, we do need that too, but we need to also start prioritizing other things like urban agriculture and suburban agriculture. And in this class, this is what I'm going to be focusing on more primarily than other forms of agriculture. So let's get into this and deconstruct some of these things. And I'm taking this from Vandana Shiva. So Vandana Shiva has written some wonderful books. Here's one of them. Who Really Feeds the World, I think it's called. Yes, Who Really Feeds the World. And in this book and in other publications that she has, she makes a very strong argument for actually flipping around our understanding of how economies function. So what she's devised here, and she's not the only one to describe these things, there's other authors that have published very similar viewpoints. But what she looks at here is there's different versions of economies. We have nature's economy. We have the natural environment that will actually replenish itself and provide for itself. For example, streams will clean itself if water runs through them. We'll have water running down from the mountain and actually cleanse itself as it runs through rocks and through soil, and then cleanse itself as it runs through streams. So, nature will actually take care of itself and cleanse itself, but also food will produce on its own. We don't need to produce food through some kind of human intervention, but actually, like, trees will grow and produce fruits if it's like a fruit tree, and these fruits will fall off the tree and then seed in the ground and then will produce more trees. If you actually have, like, for example, people that were at the Kovic garden saw the tomatillos and the ground cherries in the garden. We didn't plant those. Those actually planted themselves because the seeds fell from years past, and basically nature's replenished itself. So nature actually has a really good economy of its own that doesn't need intervention of people. We have a sustenance economy. We need people to reproduce themselves. Okay, so in order for social societies to exist, we need to sustain, and to sustain, we need to link this in things that sustain ourselves. So since the advent of capitalism, we basically separated ourselves from reproducing ourselves and our own livelihoods. And then we rely on market economies to do that. We've disconnected a lot from our food production and from other ways of reproducing ourselves in our societies. So the second most important economy is sustenance economy. We need to reproduce social systems and ourselves. And for her, the least important is market economies. So not to say that we need to do away with market economies, but we need to make sure that this is not prevailing over nature's economy and our sustenance economy. Why is that? Because nature's economy is the biosphere. Without the biosphere, we cannot sustain ourselves. People will not live if the conditions of the biosphere do not allow people to habit the world. Okay? So if market economy ends up doing away with nature's economy, markets won't exist either, because markets need people and they also need the biosphere to function. So the second most important economy is sustenance economy. So we need social systems in order to produce markets, because markets have been devised by people. They're not naturally occurring. They're things that we've invented and imposed as an economic system that basically regulates global trade and helps people provide for themselves, basically by providing a system that we could track labor and track who's trading goods and services. But we've made up the system, and we've made it to facilitate the distribution of goods and services, but now have come to believe that markets are more important than people and the natural economy. Now, all of these things, if we look at a hierarchy, nature's economy is the strongest part of the hierarchy. We need this in order to have people living, okay? But we need people that are living in order to have markets. So we have to recognize that there is a hierarchy, and we need to respect this hierarchy, or we're going to do away with all of these parts of the system. So without a nature's economy, we don't have a market and we don't have people. Without people, we don't have a market economy. So we need to recognize these things. And one way to show you is there's two different models, and one of them has actually been kind of the major focus when it comes to sustainability. If you're in business school or other places, what they teach is something called the triple bottom line, so that people, profit, and planet have to be at this equilibrium point in order to achieve full sustainability. So basically here is the mark where they say the three come together, and this is the way to become sustainable, because we need people, profit, and the planet to kind of merge into this location of sustainability. Now, this is a false assumption, and there is a better way of understanding this, and actually a more realistic way based on the conditions that are necessary for people to survive and for the environment and for markets to survive, kind of going off what I was saying in the previous slide. So the nested model understands that there are hierarchies, okay? So the economy is nested within society, and society is nested within the environment. So all sustainable models have to respect this hierarchy. We cannot do away with the environment, or we're doing away with everything that's nested within it. So what I'm encouraging you to do is, if anybody purports that this is the way to understand sustainability, I don't want you to buy into this rhetoric. I actually want you to understand that things are nested within larger systems that contain them. And basically, we're all dependent on survival of our physical and natural environment, basically the biosphere, in order for the other systems to exist within it. So other ways of understanding economies, okay? And if you want to read a really interesting book, there's a book from Catherine Gibson Graham. Basically, it's a pen name for two authors. One has now passed away. So Post-Capitalist Politic, and there's another one called Take Back the Economy. I would highly suggest that you read these books. I actually interviewed Catherine Gibson a while back, and I have an interview with her that's posted here. If you want to check that out, you could. But basically, the crux of their argument is that we see everything that is part of a capitalist economy, or basically part of a market-based economy. These are the things that we measure, and the things that basically are purported as what the economy exists as. So, we see the stock market fluctuating, and this is tangibly measured by basically people selling and buying stocks. We could measure GDP, we can measure the production based in society, but there's a lot of other things that fall under that are not measured and not necessarily part of our understanding of the economy, okay? So some of these things are like daily provisioning. So people do a lot of production in their own households, and this is not measured as part of our economy, but actually contribute to the larger economy. So what we need to do is we need to tease out all of these other things that are not part of markets and bring them to the forefront, and sometimes prioritize them. So I'm not going to go too much into detail because I don't want to lose you here, but there are ways of understanding things that are outside traditional capitalist economies or market economies. And we could divide this up into understanding labor, transactions, property, enterprise, and finance. And through that, we could actually see that there are different points of view, or basically different practices that reside within these. So within labor, well, yes, we have wage labor. So this is part of the capitalist economy, measurable. And we could have reports on wage labor, basically looking at minimum wage, maximum wages, look at employment and all of these things which are measurable. But then there's alternative paid also. So some people are self-employed, some people participate in reciprocal labor, in-kind labor, work for welfare, and things that are alternative. And also there are forms of practices that exist that are unpaid labor also that need to be recognized. So household labor, volunteer labor, self-provisioning, and slave labor still exists. Although people like to purport that in capitalism, slave labor doesn't exist. Slave labor and capitalism grew up together. And especially what I was describing, if you look at actually slavery in the United States, you could see how this has grown up with our current food system also. And if you want to get into more detail, I could actually get into more detail about this. But these are forms that exist. Not to say that one is better than another. I would definitely advocate that we don't prioritize slave labor, but we need to recognize that it still exists in our society. What we need to do is prioritize other forms also, in addition to wage labor. I'm not saying that we have to do away with this, but we need to actually look at other forms of labor that exist in society and prioritize things that are helpful to the world and not harmful. So there's different forms of transactions. We have market-based transactions, but then we have alternative market transactions, fair trade, alternative currencies, underground markets, barter, and we have non-market transactions. So household sharing, gift giving, hunting, fishing, gathering, theft, poach, piracy, other forms as well. We have property. So there's private property that's recognized in the capitalist system, but then there's other forms as well. So state managed assets, customary clan lands, community land trusts, indigenous knowledge, and we also have open forms of access also, which is atmosphere, international waters, open source IP, and outer space has not yet been commodified. Although there are pushes to commodify the atmosphere in certain ways. There's actually a company that was bottling air, or basically canning air in British Columbia and selling it in different places in China. And this has been, to me, I think the first attempt that I've seen commodifying parts of the atmosphere, basically commodifying air. Anyhow, so there are things that reside outside of capitalism also. We have different forms of enterprises. We have the traditional kind of for-profit capitalist enterprise. We also have state-owned enterprises, environmentally responsible enterprises, socially responsible enterprises, and nonprofit enterprises. We also have non-capitalists, so like worker cooperatives, sole proprietorships, communal enterprises, feudal-based systems, and slave systems also. Like I'm saying, not to say that these are better, but we have to recognize that these practices also exist. And then in finance, we have mainstream markets, but we have other forms of finances also, like cooperative banks, credit unions, community financial institutions, microfinance, and then non-market, basically sweat equity, family lending, donations, and interest-free loans. Look, this is a lot of information. I don't need you to memorize this. The one thing I want you to get out of this is that markets are not the only way to lead an economy. There are so many different practices that reside in here that if you're equating the market as the only form of economy, then we're leaving out the bigger picture. What we need to do is we need to recognize that other forms of practices exist in an economy. A lot of them are not measured. The only ones that are measured are the ones that actually provide kind of capitalist basis. And all of these other ones kind of fall to the wayside that people don't realize they exist most of the time, and they're not prioritized. What we need to do is we need to find the practices that work best for social systems and for the biosphere and prioritize those ones, rather than just only going towards wage labor, market-based transactions, private property, capitalist enterprises, and mainstream markets. And I'm going to show you a little bit about this more as we get into the contents of the class, another lecture. Now, this graph may seem a little bit complicated. This is actually taken from Ercole Gimenez. And what I want to show you in this is that there are other ways to understand how to have food movements that are not just based on food production or basically providing provisions to people that are looking only at, feeding the needy or feeding people, that don't have access to food. So there are different food movements and different approaches to the different food crises. And I didn't provide the slide before, but I'm actually going to explain this to you in the larger picture as to what Ercole Gimenez means by all of these different things, okay? So there are a number of attempts of different groups that have actually tried to alleviate some of the problems when it comes to agriculture. And one of the major issues that people have been trying to rectify is actually how do we feed the world? So there are different ways that groups and entities and institutions have gone about looking at how to feed the world and actually how to provide better agriculture. So there are ways that basically go with kind of this corporate understanding, and corporations have been advocated that what we need to do is strengthen the corporation itself and actually get them to produce more food. And by them producing more food, we're going to have somewhat of a trickle-down effect. Is that, the more the corporations produce, the more food the world is going to have. Corporations have been saying that, and the bulk of the Green Revolution has relied on that understanding, and it's actually failed us. So from 1960s onwards, we've never solved the problem. The more power we give to corporations, the more it seems that it's actually detrimental to the idea of feeding the world, okay? But this is the corporate approach of reducing food insecurity, is actually just give us more power and we're going to kind of have a trickle-down effect and unregulate markets, and we're going to be able to feed the world. The second way is in the way of development, and this usually goes by this whole notion of providing food security. So providing food security, a lot of people will look at, how do we provision food going from these big corporations and give it to the needy? You probably see like foundations that are like, let's help feed Africa, or let's help feed the needy in certain environments, different food banks and different things like that. Basically, they accept the same notion that corporations are the ones that should actually be producing food, except for the kind of difference in here is that they're saying, well, we need to kind of regulate corporations and take food from there that's being wasted and give it to people that need it. So some examples, and if you're looking at provisions in Montreal, there's been a push towards getting grocery stores not to throw out their food, but to give it to food banks. We have places like Moisson Montréal and other places that are actually getting foods from these big grocery stores and giving it to people that need it. And great, that's wonderful, but it's a band-aid solution. It doesn't actually tackle the main problem, is that when corporations have too much power, they're not going to give food to the needy, and we can't feed the world through providing provisions, and just trying to look at band-aid solutions to food insecurity. There are another kind of more progressive and radical approaches that we need to empower people to be local food producers on their own. So basically, they need to get involved into kind of solidarity economies. They need to, form co-ops and provide agroecology and just make a better food system itself that's cooperative. Okay, so basically, that a lot of the urban agriculture situations in Montreal are part of this empowerment idea. Is that we're going to provide something different and a new model that is going to actually challenge the old dominant models, and we're going to do this in a better way that empowers people and empowers, or doesn't destroy the land in the process. So this is more of a progressive movement and actually does start to address some of the systemic issues. And then there's more of the entitlement, or basically what they call the food sovereignty approach, that is actually about dismantling the system itself. So the system is broken and rotten from the core, and it's really great to kind of provide alternative food provisions and feed the needy, but the condition is that global capitalism doesn't function and is actually exacerbating these major issues. And in order to solve the problem, we actually have to dismantle the global capitalist system and have a better system in play that will actually address these large global problems. Now, not to say that there's one approach to what system is better afterwards, and this is where there's a whole series of contentious debates. They're not arguing for a specific system, but basically that capitalism is the problem and needs to be dismantled in order to alleviate the issues that I was describing in the slides above. So what I'm saying here, what we need to do is we need to prioritize more progressive and more radical systems if we're going to really change the world. Okay? If we're going to really want to feed the world, and if we really want to alleviate climate change and the contribution of agriculture that is actually leading to an habitable world, we need to dismantle and or think of other approaches and provide different systems and not just rely on corporations and provisions from them to redistribute the wealth. All right, so there are ways to do this, and one way that I've done this is I've actually started to study food systems. This is a map that I built looking at Concordia's food system. So these are the campus community food groups in and around Concordia. And actually, I've done this with other classes too. So the course that I taught over the summer in food and sustainability, we actually looked at Lachine, the town of Lachine here in Montreal, and actually looked at the food system within that and are actually deconstructing what is taking place to identify what parts of the food system exist and what we need to prioritize within that food system to make a better system itself. So basically looking at kind of productive capabilities and identifying, like through the graph that I showed you in Gibson Graham, there are people that are growing food on campus and off campus, but also there's knowledge production and other things taking place. So there's groups that produce food, process food. So groups that actually transform food on campus and other things as well. There's different forms of distribution. So like I was showing you in Gibson Graham's model, there's market-based and non-market-based practices. And I've identified some of those and basically looked at different waste management groups also at Concordia, identifying different parts of the food system, identifying the practices, and then hopefully help prioritize the ones that are helpful in the way of feeding. Here, people in this food system are usually Concordia students and faculty, but we could implement this model into communities and larger approaches also. So this is ways of identifying and mapping food systems, and then also from that, looking at how to devise a better food system. Now, I've also kind of provided pictures here, and some of you are going to come to the Covic Garden, hopefully. But here's one example of an urban garden that was actually built in order to provide food provisions for the community in ways that are not specifically just tied to markets, but actually redistribute to food banks also. So here's a garden, and it's being managed by Covic. Covic is a larger nonprofit organization that looks after the well-being of the people in the social housing units. You see the building here, but there's a number of social housing units, and Kovik is the larger association that helps provide provisions for this social housing unit. So they do youth programs, they do a whole bunch of different things. And one of the parts of this is a part of basically the urban agriculture garden and a larger food system. Basically, they also have a community kitchen, which is not presently doing anything because of the COVID situation. But anyhow, they do have access to a community kitchen also. So within this, all of the infrastructure in here was built this summer. The garden itself at the beginning of the year was basically laid bare. There was a whole bunch of different weeds growing and flowers. It was quite invasive and not well kept. Mohammed is actually the person that was hired to look after this garden. You know, somebody that's got a PhD in agriculture and very highly specialized to put this together. I participated with him in the summer and helped build some of these structures. So we built above ground structures here so that we could actually build things vertically, and built all of these mini garden beds within it to grow the food. And as you can notice, we're growing a lot of different annual and some even perennial vegetables, flowers, as well as herbs and spices and fruits within that also. So this is an aerial shot of the garden. And the idea of this basically is to reconnect the community to their own food provisions. So there is a market that we sell and distribute the food at. They're called Le Petit Marché de Lachine. So 5 days a week, basically Monday to Friday, there's a market that's set up in different areas in Lachine. And we sell the local produce from this garden here, as well as a neighbor garden. Basically, it's called Farm Caria or Jardin Caria in Saintville. It's a local organic farm that's actually in the West Island. And we combine our produce from both places and sell them at Le Petit Marché de Lachine. On Thursday, the market is actually pretty much right beside where this Kovik garden is. So we basically eliminated the distance traveled from where the food is being produced to the garden or to the market itself. Literally, it's a block away from this garden, and from Saintville, it's like a 20-minute drive. And we could actually produce in high volumes here, what we call spin farming, so small plot intensive farming. I'm not going to get too much into the details about this because I'm going to run out of time, and I'd like you to still discuss other things related to our readings. But just here are some pictures of the garden. This is one day in the summer. We harvested a bunch of radishes and carrots and a bunch of other stuff as well. But you can see here, we get very large volumes of food, especially those of you that have come out to the garden recently have experienced that. Some of the stuff we planted here that you're going to get to see, but as you notice, there's not much space to walk around. We plant as much volume as possible in very small locations and try to increase the biodiversity as much as possible because we actually, we want different companion plants and we need to attract pollinators and all of this stuff. So there's a lot of biodiversity happening in a very small location. You can see, our vertical structures here, as well as some of the amaranth and other things that are growing. There's, when you come to the garden, you'll get to see all of the different plants that are being produced. Those of you that have come to the garden, you'll notice actually the plants are a little bit smaller in this picture than you're noticing. The plants, a lot of them, the tomato plants especially, are like close to 10 feet tall now, even growing above the structures that we built. So here's just another look at some of the structures and some of the row covering. The row covering, you'll see like this kind of sheet of like white in the back over there. We provide row covering so that the cabbage moths don't eat at the kale, or other harmful insects like flea beetles don't come and bite holes in the leafy greens. Here in the back, there's a little bit of a permaculture garden. I'm standing beside Mohammed, and this is some of my students from the Food and Sustainability course this summer that came out to the garden. Here's another look at some of the permaculture garden. In back of me, there's fruit trees and other berry bushes and some medicinal herbs and spices and things in the garden also. Other view of like some of the structures here. This is just some of the students that have been harvesting. Here they're harvesting carrots. This is me reaching over, showing people some of the stuff growing on the fence. And those of you that have been to the garden or that will come are going to notice that actually there's a lot of beans growing up the fence now. It's actually hard to see through the fence presently. So you'll notice also the rows are quite narrow. They're hard to walk through. This is why I want 20 people to come at a time. If I have 100 people at once, we're not going to be able to move around this garden. You'll notice these arch structures, which we built also because eventually when it gets a little bit cold, we're going to put plastic over it and it's going to make a greenhouse. So we could extend the growing season later than usual because we could grow cold hardy crops, especially under a greenhouse condition, by building this very easy structure here. And this is Mohammed. He's the person that looks after the garden. This is me. And some of the students working on the garden here. I don't have to get into too much detail because hopefully you'll all get to see, but this is just some of the things that we've been able to do on very small plots, produce large amounts of food and actually distribute it locally. So not only should people get involved in local radical and progressive food movements, but we could actually re-provision and relocalize our food through urban agriculture settings. And this is just some examples. And what I would like to explore with you throughout the rest of this course is other examples that take place also. Because look, we're doing a very small kind of garden here in Lachine. What I would love to see happen is replicating what we've done as a model throughout Montreal, in different areas all throughout the city. Like this is possible. We could have growing areas right beside the distribution areas. We could link these things to markets in the way that they become economically viable. And then actually all of the surplus could go to food banks. This is what's technically happening right now. So this itself has other provisions in the model. It's not just reliant on profit. Actually, profit is not the kind of forefront of why we're doing this. We want to become viable, but at the same time, we actually want to provide to the community. And by doing so, we provide volunteer opportunities, we enhance biodiversity, we provide a really nice garden for people to come and check out. We're reducing the space traveled between where the food is being produced and where it's being sold. And then anything that's left over goes to food banks. All of this is organic. It's actually being grown without chemicals and fertilizers. And it's grown in a way that's, conducive to permaculture. We don't intervene all that much in the garden. We let nature kind of take its course unless it's necessary to intervene. So that is a long lecture here, but I wanted to provide some context as to what problems we want to identify and what to do about them. And this will provide a basis for a lot of the discussions that we're going to be having about urban agriculture. So I'm going to take some questions from you all. I see 42 questions in the chat, but I don't know if I've answered this or not. Instead, just raise your hand and I can get to you and I can answer any questions or concerns that you have presently. And then hopefully we have time to do the last assignment. So here I have Samuel, I have Aiden, and I have Chloe and Martin, and anybody else that wants to raise their hand, feel free to do so. So go ahead, Samuel.
All right, I forgot I had raised it at the beginning. There's just someone that had asked if you could put the slide full screen, because I imagine there might be some people who are like on their phones and maybe it's small to read. But yeah, that was just it. I just forgot to remove it.
Okay, sorry about that. And look, I know some people are posting in the chat as I'm doing the lecture. It's hard for me to flip back and forth because what I've noticed actually, especially in the first class, when I'm doing that and I go back to the chat, I get caught up in the chat and I can't really get through the lecture. So thank you very much for saying that, Sam. I guess it's a little bit too late. Next time I'll make it full screen. Sorry about that. But if you want to download the slides, actually, I put them on my site. So you can always go back to this video afterwards and go through the slides if you want.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's someone later in the chat that told it was on the website. So yeah, that's
okay.
Great.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sam. Aiden, you're next.
Hey, yeah, it's pretty sad, a lot of the information about the food industry, and a lot of it seems like newsworthy stuff, and I'm surprised that I haven't really learned about it beforehand or talked to anyone who kind of knew about that. So do you have any idea to why maybe it's not as well known about like some of the problems of the food industry?
Yeah, well, just, one of the issues that I think is a prevailing issue is that people are so disconnected from their own food production. So people will go to the store and they're gonna, see whatever the produce is available. We don't have labeling of GMO products, so people don't really know what they're buying most of the time. They don't know what's been sprayed on it. They don't know what companies produced it. We have a little bit of information about where the location of the food has come from, But right now, actually, if you go to the grocery store, the majority of our food is coming from external locations. So it's just become kind of commonplace for us to understand food in this process. The other thing too is a lot of people are not buying local, or not local, but like actual physical produce, but they're buying transformed food. So like, for example, like fruit roll-ups, or like, here's a weird example, but those goldfish things, like what the heck is that even? It's not even like a food thing. It's a commodity that actually has no tangibility in real food. KFC has actually devised a new thing that they're actually putting into markets. They have a 3D printer that's going to be 3D printing chicken for them through this biotechnology that basically they're using bacterial cultures, and they're making meat out of this bacterial culture through the 3D printing mechanism, that they're going to be growing this weird, whatever it is, chicken. It's not even considered chicken anymore. And so food has become super detached from actually what food really is. And we have this kind of weird belief that we need to industrialize all of our food to feed the world. The reality is the more we commodify food, we actually are feeding less people, because now it becomes restricted. So we don't need these kind of bacterial cultures for meat. We need to actually start reconnecting with our natural environment and with our social systems. And, look, I'm a vegetarian. I don't eat meat, okay? So I could argue very strongly against eating meat, but people that do want to eat meat, there's more ethical ways of doing so also. Agroecology incorporates animals back into the farming practice. It's actually a method that's been used for centuries, or even longer than that. And actually, we're losing these practices because we're going to more industrialized techniques of, look, we're just going to spray the crops, and we're just going to put chemicals back in the fertilizer, wherever, to reproduce our soils. These things are destroying the environment. And there's actually a lot of documentaries that are coming out addressing this now. I'm really hoping that people realize this in the bigger picture and start to do something about it, because if we're going to address climate change, this is the major culprit right now. So, your answer, or the answer to the question, is quite complex. But I really believe that we need to connect with food. And when people start doing that, they're going to start to understand how food is produced. And then in the bigger picture, hopefully start to realize that, we need to reproduce food in ways that are more ethical. And, start making bread, start transforming food, start growing things, and you'll appreciate the labor that goes involved. And you're actually going to appreciate the food that you're producing. You pick a tomato right from your garden, you eat it. And I'm not just saying this, the tomato will taste better because you pick it at its most ripe moment. And at the same time too, actually, when you take a tomato out, what happens is that it starts to transform from the time that it's picked. The best time to eat it is right after it's picked, okay? Because after, the chemicals of the tomato are going to go into making sure the seeds will survive so that it can reproduce itself later on. You don't have as good of a tomato over time. Although, if you want it more kind of sugary, if you leave it out a little bit, yes, that will kind of enhance some of the sugars that are going to go into the fruit. But, if it's sitting in a supermarket for a month or something, it doesn't really taste good after. So these are ways that people could reconnect. And I think the issue is that we are so separated from these systems that we don't even think about this in the larger picture.
Right. Yeah. It's like, it's now normalized, right? I think that's the problem too. It's now normalized through supermarkets too, because I was reading in the book like 5 or 4 generations of supermarkets. I feel like now it's normalized to not have basic food, but more transformed food and transformed snacks, and not to really get, the basic, the core and natural kind of food.
Yeah, for sure. So let's denaturalize that and actually normalize other behavior that will actually help our system. Thank you for that. I see Chloe and then Martin.
Much of a question,
Yep.
but I wanted to say something.
Yep.
I have done research on Monsanto. When I was in high school, I did a project about GMOs. So I looked into Monsanto, and I've also watched the Food Inc. documentary from that was talked about in the thing. It's absolutely disgusting. That documentary is filthy and disgusting and gross, and just makes me, when I was watching it forever ago, it made me feel like I was in a puke.
So hopefully it actually compels you to action rather than just being disgusted. But we could change these things.
I'd like to do stuff, but there wasn't anything I could do. I was a high school student.
Yeah,
doing.
yeah. And look, in this course, this is why, I'm introducing you to these topics and encouraging you to go out to gardens and to form, collective associations or things that are actually going to address these issues. So if you watch these documentaries and are disgusted, great. Step one. Step two, let's do something about it. And throughout the course, we're going to talk about how we're going to address these issues. So thank you, Chloe. Martin is next.
So I was just wondering, because I looked into the papers and I had other sources before, and can you guys hear me? Can you hear me well?
Yep, I can hear you.
And it's pretty interesting when you see stuff from the Great Depression or the two World Wars where people were completely deprived, well, pretty much, and they had to garden, make subsistence garden with little to no money. And now there's like stuff like spin and permaculture. And I was wondering which one you think is the best between the modern spin methods and those old timey methods to make the most with as little as possible.
Mm-hmm. So that's a really great question. What I would say is that, like to say that this is specifically permaculture and this is spin farming, they're different. There's overlap between these different methods. So what I would recommend is actually what is the best form that's needed for the environment that we're a part of. So, in Montreal, if we need food provisions and, for example, the community eats this type of food, I would say that that's what should be prioritized. Through the different methods, if we're in urban agriculture, spin methods are the most productive. Actually, you brought up a really interesting point because a lot of the gardens, especially what they call victory gardens or war gardens, part of it was actually about food provisions, and they were able to produce a lot of their food from urban environments. But sorry?
Do we still have like complete resource, like complete books detailed with tons of techniques from that time?
I don't know offhand, but I could actually look for some if you want.
Yeah, that'd be great.
The techniques are not far off of what's happening now. So,
okay.
There are different techniques that were basically what you need to look at is irrigation techniques, companion planting techniques, soil remediation techniques. And a lot of these things that are being implemented today are actually, techniques that have been used for centuries. And actually a lot of the modern farming is actually going back to the old style of farming. So they're not too far off from each other. Specifically, I could take a look though and see if there were books written about farming techniques there, urban agriculture. I'm sure there are. But also to add to what you were saying, a lot of these gardens were not just about producing as much food as possible, but actually about forming communities and boosting people's morale. And this still exists in a lot of gardens in Montreal. There's a lot of collective gardens or community gardens that are not necessarily just about producing as much food, but actually about bringing people together, doing things that are part of a community, and actually increasing the morale and increasing kind of community connections. So that's valuable on its own too. And the war gardens were actually a big part of forming these communities.
Okay. And one last question. Do you know where in Montreal you can? There's grocery stores or the equivalent where you can buy food that mostly grows in Quebec, or if you have some places?
Yes. So Jean-Martin Fortier, who's one of the kind of guru gardeners at this point.
Yeah.
He's working with the Desmarais family, and basically, providing. He does a bunch of rooftop gardens and sells local produce there. So what we're noticing is actually there are large corporations that are jumping into the bandwagon on local production and organic production. Another example, and I don't know if you know who this is, but there's someone named Peter Zergakis, who's actually a major landowner, especially commercial landowner in Montreal. He actually owns Les Stations des Sports and all those bars and owns like a bunch of buildings all throughout Montreal. Actually, he has purchased a bunch of agriculture, basically farms, in rural Quebec and is producing organic agriculture now. So, there's weird lines being blurred. And this is why I'm saying if we really want to make a difference here, we need to look at radical approaches of changing the system also, or else basically for-profit models are going to usurp all of this and basically still restrict access unless people have money and all this. So the problems are still exacerbated, but basically just done under the guise of organic. And that's not always the way to solve these problems.
Yeah, because I was doing the readings and I was pretty much disgusted by the supermarkets now. So I was wondering how realistically I could mostly eat local.
Yeah. So I tell you, come to Les Petits Marchés de la Chine and you could definitely eat local. But there's other places in Montreal that have these provisions also. So look for what they call farmers markets, or
Yeah.
look for something called CSA baskets. It's community sponsored agriculture or community supported agriculture. And basically what you're doing is you're buying a share of the farmer's produce and you get baskets every week from it.
CSA, right?
CSA, yeah. Right now, there's not many available because the farming season is kind of winding down for the summer.
Yeah.
But Lufa Farm provides that. And, you know, they are a business also, and I'm not going to get into kind of a critique on them. But, you know, you could get baskets from Lufa Farm year round, and they do this on rooftops.
All
There's
right.
also there's one group I know called Les Bio Locaux.
Bio
It's
Loco,
like
yeah.
a like producers co-op. I worked at a market, at a Toronto market for them like a few years ago.
Mhm.
They have like bi-weekly kind of like Lufa farms, like boxes are pre-assembled, like boxes they can pick up that are made from local producers. They kind of all streamlined together. And I know they also do winter baskets that start like around November, I think they can pick up. That's one of them that I know in Montreal, and like Ichitai also has those kinds of like food baskets, I'd say.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Sam. You know what we could do is I could start a resource guide on the Facebook group or wherever we want to post this. But basically, we could share resources of where farmers markets exist throughout Montreal, and hopefully come together and find out better ways to consume food.
Yeah, that would be great.
Wonderful. Great. Well, thank you so much, Martin. I have two more people here with questions, and we're going to run out of time after that. So I have Ola and ND. So Ola, go first.
I just wanted to say one thing about, like, you were saying about the food and stuff, and you're saying like how like going vegetarian and all that, because I find that like a bit like going vegetarian is somewhat good. I was vegetarian for like 2 years, or like a year and a half or 2 years, whatever, like vegan vegetarian on and off. And yeah, I just don't find it perfectly sustainable for a lot of things. And I find like there's a bit of a biasy with people with being vegan or vegetarian. Because a lot of people think everyone should be vegan or vegetarian, but like everyone, people like we're made, like we're animals that develop only to eat vegetables, which isn't true, right? Even apes themselves also eat meat sometimes when they have to. So I think it's kind of like pushing that whole like vegan vegetarian diet is a bit like ethnocentric in a sense, because you're just assuming that everyone has the same lifestyle as you, has the same access to a big grocery store. So like, I don't know. I just don't find it like, I don't find that like that's the way. I find we should just more promote like sustainable eating, like what like in the article says, like eating locally, like having if locally you can get rabbits and snakes, I feel like you should be able to eat the rabbits and snakes than rather you have to go get like soya beans and eat soya beans, like soya beans, right? You have to kill a lot of animals in those fields. I find it would be better if someone ate a rabbit or a snake or a squirrel than have to kill a whole bunch of animals for the soy in the soy fields.
Yeah. So look, that's a great argument, and look, I agree with you in some ways. So I'm going to try to do this in as little time as possible, but we could hopefully open up this conversation again. I will never advocate that people, though everybody should stop eating meat, because I would say that is culturally irresponsible of me to do so. There are places in the world that actually rely on meat, and you know, for me to advocate otherwise, I would say would be racist. And one good example is actually the seal hunt that takes place, you know, with the Inuit population. It was like Greenpeace went after them about the seal hunt, and actually made the Inuit people look pretty bad, and had all these commercials about how barbaric it is to hunt seals. Now, Inuit people actually rely on this as their primary source of food, you know, as well as like other things like polar bears and other things that need to be hunted in the Arctic. And, you know, this is their primary source of food. When they, you know, kill these animals, they actually share them with their village and, you know, try to be as little wasteful as possible. I would say factory farming is a terrible thing, but people that are actually hunting animals in that fashion, you know, all respect to that. And I'm not going to judge people for eating meat or not. And actually, I don't think it's a solution to go to soy products, because if you look actually what's happening in the Amazon, big corporations are actually cutting down the Amazon to plant soy, mainly to feed animals, because they feed animals the soy. But at the same time, just going to soy-based diets, we have the same kind of critique. It's being done in factory-like conditions also. Now, on the flip side, though, if we're actually looking at the environmental impact, in order to produce meat requires a lot of water and a lot of food, and actually is extremely impactful on the environment. So when we have people eating meat to the extent that they're doing right now, it's a major problem for climate change, for actually water consumption, for a whole bunch of other reasons also. And actually, we could go into this a little bit more. I'm not going to be able to today. So what I would recommend in the bigger picture is, if you have the option to do so, it is better for the environment to reduce your meat consumption. But culturally speaking, I'm never going to tell people that it's bad to eat meat, because in certain areas of the world, they can't either grow vegetables like we do here, or there are different provisions where actually people need to eat based on the culture that they're part of.
So essentially, like just like what you're saying, I feel like people, if you're just a regular person, you don't do any exercise, whatever, I don't feel like you need that much meat anyways. It should all be like in moderation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The same with soy consumption and other consumption also. Look, we need to have a balanced diet, really. In order to do that, we need to eat things that are biodiverse. And look, I know I'd really like to get in this conversation a little bit more. Let's take this up at another class. I see a couple more hands here. I'm going to get to them, and thank you very much. We'll have another discussion about that at another point too. So I have ND, I have Daniel and Chloe. I know that it's past time right now, so if you don't want to stick around for the Q&A, that's okay. I apologize that my lecture was a little bit long today, I guess I had another template that we wanted to fill out, but we'll worry about that another time. So if you want to stick around, feel free to. You don't have to, but I'll take questions and then stick around until everybody leaves. So ND.
Yes, sorry about the abbreviations. This is
Okay.
my daughter's computer. I just have a quick question, which might not be directly related to today's discussion, but going back to pollinators, have you personally come across any peer-reviewed literature on the relationship between 4G and soon to come 5G cellular towers and their effects on pollinators?
Personally, I have not, but if you have
Okay.
anything, let me know. I haven't actually looked at any kind of frequencies and effects on pollinators. But look,
Okay.
if you have information, I'd love to see it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
No problem. And if I come across something, I'll let you know though. But I actually haven't even searched for that, so I don't know.
Thank you.
By the way, I just want to quickly say that I used to live in Nunavut, so it's nice to hear someone supporting the seal hunt. Yeah, just wanted to throw in that quick comment.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that too. Great. And what I'm saying, it's I strongly believe and want to make sure that people understand the bigger picture. So thank you for that too.